Over 44,000 people died by suicide in 2015. 20 veterans die by suicide daily. All faith communities affirm the gift of life is sacred and increasingly find their mission is to support, not condemn, one who acts on suicidal intent. Faith communities inherently offer members connectedness, a vital suicide prevention factor. And they can connect a hurting person seeking to end unbearable suffering to the grace of a loving God, the Creator of life. Early identification and treatment of persons at risk for suicide saves lives. Question, persuade, and refer, QPR, is a nationally recognized best practice that trains persons to do this. Listen as 6 nationally recognized suicide prevention experts share what faith communities can do to help prevent suicide.
Well, in my view, the first step has to be to get our heads out of what's called the SEP, which is SEP. That's someone else's problem. If it's someone else's problem, I have no obligation to do anything.
I guess I have a couple of thoughts about it. That if church leaders could take an interest and take just a bit of time to get educated about the reality of mental health as a real aspect of health, that mental health, physical health, and spiritual health, if you will, all have a role to play in the human being?
Probably at least a few different ways. One would be the more direct way of having people in faith communities directly involved in suicide prevention efforts, perhaps with their own congregations, perhaps with their own people. The other way is kind of in line with the idea of community supports, just being willing to do things like allow space for support groups to meet, allow people to be serving as volunteers when there's a particular effort or particular initiative in town, such as some kind of awareness walk or fundraising campaign. Even if people aren't able to lend financial resources, if they are able to marshal support in terms of volunteers or in terms of other things that they might be able to provide, such as space, I think that would make a big effort.
Sometimes it is the tools that faith-based organizations have in terms of connectedness. That's a big deal in terms of thinking about, risk versus protection in terms of people with suicidal behavior, that when you feel more connected to a community, to a group, that oftentimes you're protected against suicide. So how can faith-based communities do some work to promote connectedness within congregations or even within the neighborhood where that faith-based community sits? So definitely faith-based communities have that opportunity to enhance connectedness.
And I would also suggest that those faith communities even look within themselves to say, how healthy are we? And, the rostered members, how are they doing? Because we also know how devastating it can be when the leadership itself is not healthy in what it's doing. So, many rostered clergy often talk about their own struggles as an example.
I also think the way in which, and as a loss survivor I can speak to this, the way in which faith communities respond when there has been a suicide is of course critically important. There's a lot of myth and misunderstanding out there about suicide and the reasons for it. And so really learning to embrace a family.
Faith communities have an extremely important role in raising awareness and advocacy about suicide prevention and in terms of other mental health issues and concerns. More than anything, to hear from the faith community that God does not make mistakes, that to have a mental health issue, to have a mental illness, is just that, an illness, and not a consequence of who you are or what you've done or what you've thought or how you've lived your life or your behavior. It is not a consequence of that. It is simply an illness. An illness. And to hear from the faith community that that is what it is, and that healing is possible, and help is available, and that hope is eternal, to hear that from the faith community is remarkable and life-giving. And to know that you deserve abundant life because God promised it, and you can attain that by getting the help you need.
There are some things we are not very good at talking about, some things that still carry a stigma and so remain hidden. Suicide is one of these things. Maybe because it's frightening, unfathomable. Maybe because we were taught that it is an unforgivable sin. There are over 42,000 deaths a year in the United States by suicide. A person between the ages of 15 and 24 dies of suicide about every 2 hours in America. There has been an increase in death by suicide among those serving in the military, and the toll on family, friends, and communities of those left behind is significant and long-lasting. Clearly, suicide is something we need to talk about. Suicide is a result of painful and persistent feelings of depression, despair, and hopelessness. Often it is the final desperate act of an individual who has come to see life as intolerable and seeks to end that pain. It is not an unforgivable sin. We are never beyond God's mercy and compassion. Suicide is a tragic consequence of a mental or behavioral disorder. Properly seen as a disease of the mind, a health condition, we know that suicide can be prevented through early identification of individuals at risk who receive prompt care and treatment. Open and honest conversation about mental illness and suicide that does not stigmatize people, and awareness of spiritual and psychological resources that are available in congregations and communities will save lives. Life is precious and is a gift from God. We, as members of the body of Christ, can respond with compassion and action to those members of Christ's body who feel hopeless and alone. It is time for the church to break the silence.